That's 757-222-3705.
Good afternoon, Hampton Roads and surrounding environs. This is Drew Nickel. I'm sitting in for Nora Firestone on the Nora Firestone Show. And on behalf of all of us at WKQA Freedom 1110 on your AM dial, it is my pleasure to be hosting this show for the next hour. We've got a lot to talk about during our show, but first of all, I want to reintroduce myself to any listener who's not familiar with me. My name is Drew Nickel, and that's nickel like 5 cents with two L's, Nickell. I have a website in which I post essays, and I've done, roughly about 400 of these in the last 6 years of its existence. It's been read in 115 countries around the world. My essays are translatable into any recognizable language. And the website is www.drewnickel, that's DREWNICKELL.com. And I hope you will avail yourself of this for a couple of things. First of all, there is a search engine on the site so you can search by topic. I primarily write about national politics, but occasionally I'll put in some cultural things, sociological things. I even discuss sports. As you can see by the surroundings, I'm a definite sports fan of the Baltimore Colts, not Indiana no place, but the Baltimore Colts, as well as the Baltimore Orioles, and I've been known to even follow the Ravens in these last years. So, but we're not going to be talking about sports today. We're going to be talking about the presidential election. But before we get to that, I do want to alert you about a couple of things that are happening, and I hope that they're nice things. First of all, 4 years ago, I published a book called Bending Your Ear, a collection of essays on the issues of our time. And it had, roughly about 120 of my essays compiled together by topic. So like there was a chapter on Obama, there's a chapter on Hillary, there's a chapter on Trump, etc. And that book is now being republished, if you will, and reissued under a new name. The name of that book, and it's on the market, is All That Rendered Trump. And you can find All That Rendered Trump if you'll just search my name on Amazon, Drew Nickel, Nickell, and it'll take you to my author's page. And you'll see both Bending Your Ear, which was the original publication, and then the revised publication is All That Rendered Trump. And I'm not finished. Following this year's presidential election, I'm coming out with another book called What Trump Hath Wrought. So those are my nonfiction attempts at publication, and the first book did very well. I'm counting on the second book and the third book to do even better. But also, I'm also in the process of finishing up the contracts and the edits on my first novel, which has nothing to do with politics. It actually is historical fiction. It takes place in the 1700s primarily. It starts at the Salem witch trials and goes forward. So that's a good short read, but that's going to be available on the market before Halloween. So again, go to drewnickel.com to see updates on the publication releases. And if you'd like a personalized autograph edition, you can actually order that from my website, and the details are on there. I'll pay for the sales tax and the shipping and handling. So all you have to do is order it from that site, and you'll be shipped a book with my autograph, personalized how you wish it to be. And several hundred people have taken advantage of that as well in the original publication, Bending Your Ear. So I hope you will look me up and challenge me and see what I have to say. I've been following national politics for 50 years. That's not an overstatement. If you can see my well unshorn and white hair, I'm 62 years old. And I've been following national politics since the age of 10. It was first kind of as a hobby, but then it became an avocation. And when I majored in journalism at JMU, I also got a degree that included minor concentrations in U.S. history, jurisprudence, and political science in both the United States and in Great Britain, as I was fortunate enough to study these subjects in both. So I hope that you will avail yourself of, it's kind of like when you've been studying national politics this long, you kind of get an idea of the ebb and flow of political discourse. And one of the things I've kind of realized along the years is what goes around comes around. So let's start by talking about the state of our nation. We're a nation that is in peril. And it's not something that you can lay the blame at Donald Trump's feet, but moreover, it's really the result of 40 years of globalism. Now, the globalism that I'm speaking of started a little bit in the Reagan administration, but it went full force when George H.W. Bush took over the presidency in 1989. And there seemed to be a lot of resistance to Reagan. If you remember when he ran, the mainstream Republicans favored the Bushes, first George H.W. Bush, and most of the quote-unquote connected Republicans wanted to support him over Reagan. Reagan was a populist, and I want you to remember that word populist because it's coming into play now. The Bushes, both the father and son, were definite globalists, as was both of the Clintons, Hillary and Bill, and Obama. And if you think in the last terms of the last 30 years, say since 1990, this country has drifted towards a globalistic profile that resulted in the people saying enough is enough. We don't want our jobs exported overseas. We don't want to take my employment away from me and give it to someone overseas because they're in a developing nation. If there's anything that history teaches us about the history of the United States, this country has given far more in both treasure and blood to ensure the freedom of man than any country in the history of this earth. The lives we have lost defending the rest of the world against tyranny over many wars and many decades vouchsafes the United States as, and I hope this doesn't sound too melodramatic, but as the savior of the world. Now, a lot of you listeners, especially those of you who have gone to university in the last 30 years, think that I'm just an old coot expressing outdated views. But that is unfortunate because those of you who are under 40 never got the same education in our history that those of us over 40 got. And I know this to be true because several years ago, I picked up my son's history book. Having a lifelong interest in history, I was wondering if things had changed since I was in school, and boy had they. The history that's being taught to students today is far removed from the history that those of us over 40 remember from our own teaching. We were taught why this country was founded. It was founded as a revolt against the King of England. The revolt against the King of England was the result of a faraway government taxing and regulating the colonies, and yet the colonies themselves could provide no reason for that continuation because the Crown of England didn't care about the colonies other than what they could tax from them. And they started taxing everything from tea to written documents to books to stationery, etc., till finally the colonials said, why are we throwing all of this money away on a foreign crown when they don't do anything to protect us and our needs? So the revolution happened. But what these students are being taught today is that our country didn't begin in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. They're teaching their students today that the country began in 1619 when 19 black Africans were offloaded from ships at Point Comfort near Hampton, and that began slavery in the United States. What children are being taught today is that's when the United States began, because they're being taught that the United States is not a country based on individual freedom. The United States is based on a inbred racist doctrine, and they assail the United States for being a racist nation that was designed to perpetuate slavery. I'm going to tell you once and for all, and I challenge any professor who has an upper degree in U.S. history to call into the show and challenge the fact that that premise, that we are a slave racist nation that began in 1619, is a lie. It is a lie designed to take national pride away from the United States so they can usher in a replacement for the United States. The only way a country as strong as the United States can be overthrown is for the intelligentsia, that's what I'll label all of these elitists, for the intelligentsia to convince us that the United States is inherently corrupt and therefore must be completely torn asunder if we're ever going to achieve a more egalitarian society. And that is a second load of crap that's being put on these students today. And I want to tell you right now, that is also a bold-faced lie. The United States and Great Britain are solely responsible for eradicating slavery in the Western Hemisphere, because it was the United States and Great Britain who, in the early years of the 1800s, began patrolling the ocean to arrest slavers. Now, what is a slaver? A slaver was someone who transported African slaves from Africa to the West Indies and ultimately to the American markets. And that took place primarily prior to the American Revolution. The slave trade was outlawed on the high seas in the early 1800s. And the sale and transport of slaves to the United States was halted in the 1830s. Now, as you all well know, slavery didn't end until the end of the Civil War, 35 years later. But the importation of slaves stopped, and most of all of the slaves that were in the United States after the 1830s were descended from other slaves who were already here. And as we all well know, this nation was embroiled in a civil war that cost upwards of 700,000 American lives so that we could settle once and for all two issues. The primary issue being, does a state have the right to leave the Union if its people feel like being part of that Union is no longer a viable alternative? That's called the right of secession, or commonly called states' rights, and that was put asunder by the end of the war. It was ultimately determined that a state does not have the right to leave the Union. The second aim of the Civil War, and it only became an aim of the Civil War in 1862 when Lincoln drafted, and then on New Year's Day 1863 put into effect the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation decreed that all slaves in the southern states who were in rebellion against the United States, those are the 11 Confederate states, all slaves were from there on were considered free, and that the United States military would aid in their emancipation. So from 1863 on, the Civil War changed its purpose from the constitutional question of secession to the elimination of slavery. And it was in the second half of the war that purpose was taken on. Once the war ended, the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery began, and shortly thereafter, the black man was given the right to vote, some 50 years before white women were given the right to vote. Now, the last slave the last person who was a slave in the United States died in 1973 at a very advanced age of somewhere between 119 and 121. That was the last person. He was a man, and he was the last person that was a slave, and he died in 1973. So it's been about 47 years since the last person who was a slave lived this life on earth. That comes into question about reparations. We'll get to that in a minute. But we need to understand, if we don't know the accurate history of the United States, how in the world are we going to know how to pursue the future of the United States? It was often said, and often echoed by many, that those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat the tragic mistakes of its past. And what I'm seeing that is happening today harkens back so much to things that have happened in prior societies where actual governments have been capitulated to revolutionary movements. Now, I want to call your attention to a book that was written in the mid-19th century, that was the mid-1800s, called The Communist Manifesto. It was written by Karl Marx and Max Engels. Marx and Engels put together this book, The Communist Manifesto, because what they wanted to do was they wanted to present their image of an egalitarian society. And the whole idea behind the Communist Manifesto, their theory was that it was inevitable, that because of expanding populations, because of class divisions, etc., that the world could only end up in a one-world communist state. Those theories gave rise to the Russian Revolution. And the Russian Revolution, which took place during World War I, was actually the third attempt at revolution, but finally, Germany needed to get Russia out of World War I. If you'll recall, Russia was fighting Germany in World War I. They needed to get Russia out of the war, so what did they do? They sabotaged Tsarist Russia by sending in a revolutionary named Lenin. He was living in exile in Germany, and he was literally railroaded into the Soviet Union to foment revolution. And he and Joseph Stalin and Trotsky, the three of them, put together the Russian Revolution that caused first the dethroning of the Tsar and ultimately the murder of the Tsar, the Tsarina, and his many children. They were all put to death for the reason that by putting the entire family to death, they were assured that the country would not return under rule of the Tsar. It was a very cruel and tragic chapter in the history of Russia. It wasn't enough for them to oust the king, as it were, a Tsar, T-S-A-R is a king in Russian, but to murder him, his wife, and all of his children so they would assure it would never return to his rule. And that was the beginnings of the communism in the world. Other countries fell into the same scenario where you had communist revolutions taking place in South America, in Africa, in Asia. Most famously, the Long March of Mao Zedong, which brought on the Cultural Revolution in China. China had been a nationalist country under the heavy rule of Chiang Kai-shek, and they were an ally of ours in World War II. But again, just as Russia was driven out of World War I when the seeds of revolution was planted in Russia, that effectively ended Russia's participation in World War I. The same thing happened towards the end of World War II with the Long March of Mao. Yes, Chiang Kai-shek and Nationalist China were united with us to try to defeat Japan in the Pacific Theater. But as the war was coming to an end, the revolution in China was growing under Mao, and that Long March eventually ousted Chiang Kai-shek to Taiwan. And Taiwan to this day, also called Formosa, is a exiled government of Communist China, and China never has acknowledged the existence of that exiled government. So Taiwan is what they call a disputed territory. The West has great business interests in Taiwan, and the Communist Chinese, of course, want Taiwan under their thumb, just like they're placing Hong Kong under their thumb. You see, that's what communism has in common, regardless of where it sprouts up. Ultimately, what they want to do is silence opposition. What they want to do is create a state where there are no other political parties, and we've seen this again and again, most recently, say, in Venezuela. Venezuela was once the most they were the wealthiest country in terms of individual wealth, per capita wealth, in the Western Hemisphere other than the United States. But it didn't take long once Hugo Chavez came in with his communist revolution supported by communists in Cuba that was destroyed, and now Venezuela is one of the most impoverished countries in the world. This is what communism does. Communism is an extension of socialism, and both are designed to take away power from the individual and give that power to the state. That's why historically socialism, communism has been at odds with religion, because socialism and communism demands that the first order is to get rid of religion, and we saw this happen over and over again in Russia, in China, elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere where communist revolutions took place. The first thing they went after was the Catholic Church. Why? Because the Catholic Church since the 19-teens has been united against communism because they recognize it as an atheistic state and therefore an improper state for human beings. The communists have declared war on the Catholic Church many, many times in Portugal during the 19-teens. And it was during that time that Catholics were not allowed to celebrate Mass in Portugal, and it was in Portugal where those three little children of Fatima saw the apparition of the Virgin Mary. And she warned those children, do not let Russia spread the error of her ways, or the world will be consumed in a second world war. And sure enough, that happened. These children saw her in 1917. She warned that if Russia was allowed to spread her errors throughout the world, that a second world war would take place. And sure enough, it happened. You know, a lot of people, they believe the lie that Hitler is to the right as Stalin was to the left. And they base that on the fact that the two of these, which at one time were allied megalomaniacs, eventually Hitler went back on his treaty with the Soviets and attacked them. And from then on, the Soviet Union was an ally of ours trying to defeat Hitler. But National Socialism is just another form of socialism, as is communism another form of socialism. Just as the Stalin-Lenin regime came in and replaced the Tsar's picture with portraits of Lenin in the classrooms in Russia, Hitler, one of the first things he did after he was named Chancellor of Germany in 1933, his brown shirts went around to all of the schools and removed crucifixes from the walls over the blackboards, removed pictures of the Virgin Mary in Catholic schools, and replaced both of those with portraits of Adolf Hitler. You see, what you have to do is, in this kind of mindset, is you have to remove symbols of the divine, such as a crucifix or a portrait of the Virgin Mary, symbols of the kings or czars, just as you remove the pictures of the Tsar of Russia. And here in the United States, the same thing is happening. First, they go after the statues of Confederate generals who no longer meet the acceptable standards of our age. And you always have a problem when you take the standards of today and try to apply it to things that happened decades ago and judge the actions of those people based on our own ruler. For instance, here's a ruler. It can measure 12 inches. But if you try to measure a football field with this, back, forth, over and over again, inevitably you're going to get an error. And it's not going to measure out to be 3 times 100 yards or 300 of these rulers. You can put them end to end, but the chance is there's going to be a mismatch. It's not lined up properly, and you're not going to come up with the exact measurement. That's why they invented the tape measure. Well, when we try to invent means by which we judge people from the early 1800s by the standards that we have today, inevitably we're going to come into trouble for 2 reasons. Number one, who is to say that the standards we live by today are any better than the standards that were lived by 200 years ago? Yes, of course, we now would think that the introduction of slavery is abhorrent, whereas 200 years ago, not everybody felt that way. In those regards, yeah, we have improved as a society, but look at the difference. People in the 1800s, by and large, were part of their communities in a way that they're not anymore. Let me explain. In the 1930s, for instance, this country was in the throes of the greatest depression we've ever seen. Millions of Americans were out of work. I think at the height of the Great Depression, the unemployment rate was upwards of 25%. And yes, we got close to that percentage when we had to stop the economy earlier this year. But if you could imagine a time where 25% of the people in this country were unemployed and there was no social safety net provided by the government. There was no welfare. There was no food stamps. There was no aid for dependent children or aid for single mothers. None of that. There was no such aid provided by the government when the Great Depression began. You had bread lines, you had soup lines, you had unemployed men selling apples for 5 cents apiece, hoping to make a penny on the apple. And this is how they would spend their entire days, just to feed their family. But there was something else present in the Great Depression that sadly has gone away when our culture has changed since then. In the 1930s, people living in the United States, generally speaking, were in part of a community that was united by a church. And the churches and the church communities filled in where the economy wouldn't and enabled people to eat. They were given shelter. They were given protection. That wouldn't exist today because that social service, if you will, has been replaced by government providing these things. There's no reason why en masse churches or synagogues or other places of worship have to provide food and other essentials to the poor to the extent that they used to have to, because the government has taken their place. yes, and that was probably on balance a good thing. But the bad part of that is people were no longer dependent on the church, and many of them drifted away, and that's why church membership today is at the lowest level it ever has been. And that's not only Catholicism, but that's all main lines of Protestant churches as well as other faiths. People are falling away from their faiths. And that is the sad change in what I'll call sociology for the purpose of this broadcast. That change has meant that people no longer think of themselves as part of a community, but rather part of a nation on whom they are dependent for their goods. Enter in the welfare state. The welfare state got its first impetus with the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration. And I want you to think about this because the Roosevelt administration, in 1937, the Supreme Court ruled against several aspects of the New Deal. In order to countermand that, President Roosevelt wanted to stack the courts, and he attempted to do so. His idea was there's 9 justices on the Supreme Court. There have been 9 since 1870. Let's have 6 more. That way, he could get a Supreme Court majority that would go along with the New Deal. You see, history repeats itself because what are the Democrats trying to do today? They're trying to pack the court. And by trying to pack the court, what they're essentially doing is this, and it's the old adage: when you can't win, change the rules. They're doing this with their attempt to hold off Donald Trump from appointing a Supreme Court nominee because it happens to be an election year. Well, I don't remember them really going along with him nominating Brett Kavanaugh or Neil Gorsuch before. So basically, the Democrats' mindset is because it's Donald Trump, he's not allowed to name justices to the Supreme Court. We have to wait until a more acceptable president is elected and let him nominate members of the Supreme Court. Thing is, the Constitution doesn't see it that way. The Constitution says the president is elected to a 4-year term. During that term, he is to name justices to the Supreme Court based upon vacancies that arise. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, that was when Donald Trump nominated Amy Coney Barrett to be her replacement. The Democrats said, oh, wait, we have to have an election first before we decide who gets to nominate. Well, isn't that convenient? They're trying to change the rules. But the rules have been in place since the Constitution was founded. Yes, in 2016, Barack Obama was denied a chance to name Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court. But at the time, Obama, being a Democratic president, had a Republican Senate. And since the president names a nominee on advice and consent of the U.S. Senate, you can't have a president in one party and the Senate in the hands of the opposite party because they're not going to agree on the nominee. Merrick Garland didn't stand a chance from the get-go because with the Republican majority, they weren't going to not approve his nomination to the Supreme Court. So Mitch McConnell said, nope, we have to wait till after the election. Now, that was a chance because the Senate might have flipped to Democrats and maybe Hillary Clinton would have won, like everybody, all of the experts said she was going to win. And then she would have had the selection. But this time around, Donald Trump has a Republican Senate, and he is a Republican. Therefore, there's a very good chance that the person Donald Trump ultimately nominates would be confirmed by a Republican Senate. That's why Donald Trump is making this nomination. But there's another thing at play here. As we saw in the election of 2000, there's a very good possibility that this election may end up in the Supreme Court to ultimately decide, just like they had to decide in 2000 in the case Bush versus Gore. And it's going to be, Trump versus Biden, because in a contested election, ultimately the Supreme Court decides. And if they can't decide, then it goes to the House. So let's look at the scenario where, let's say, following the election, it can't be determined who won a majority of the electoral votes. In other words, 270 electoral votes. So it ends up in the Supreme Court. Well, if there are only 8 justices in the Supreme Court, there's a very good chance that the vote would end up being 4-4. So then what? What are we supposed to do? Flip a coin? Draw lots? You know, how many fingers do I have behind my back, Mr. President? And if you get it right, you get to be president. And if you don't, Biden gets to be president? No, that's not our system. Our system says those things will ultimately be determined by the courts. Now, if the Supreme Court is unable to resolve the election, then it goes into the House of Representatives. But it's not based on which party has a majority in the House. It's a complicated thing, but I think I can explain it to you. In such a scenario, and it's never happened, each state, there's 50 of them right now, each state would have one vote, regardless of the size of their congressional delegation. So in that scenario, say a small state like Rhode Island, Delaware, and I'm talking about population, Montana, states that Hawaii that have perhaps only 1 or 2 representatives, their vote in such a scenario would weigh the same as California and New York, because each state's delegation has 1 vote in that scenario. So you'd have 50 total votes. Right now, despite the fact that the House of Representatives has a majority of Democrats in the House and Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker, as it happens, of the 50 states, 26 of them have a majority of Republican congressmen to represent their state, and 24 states have a Democratic majority to represent their state. So let's say it comes down to that. Each state has this vote. Well, you know that California and New York, their delegations, because they're primarily Democrat, are going to say, we want Biden. Other states, such as, say, Mississippi, Alabama, those are red states, so-called, and because a majority of their delegation would be Republican, they would presumably vote for Trump. So based on that, the vote would be 26 states voting for Donald Trump, 24 states voting for Joe Biden. Donald Trump becomes the president. So that's what happens if the courts are unable to resolve the election. It's never happened, but the framers wisely came up with the idea, what do we do if? What do we do if? And they even envision a scenario where an election could not be determined based on how we normally determine elections. That is what is behind this push to have mail-in balloting. Because mail-in balloting, basically what that is you are sent a ballot, whether you request it or not. You're sent a ballot from your state, from your precinct, with the option that you could fill in the dots, mail it in, and it would be counted. But these ballots in states that have mass mailed these ballots have been sent to addresses that haven't been checked. For instance, in Virginia, where I live, in a certain number of counties, a mass mailing of ballots went out, and these were primarily in Northern Virginia, which obviously those counties are primarily blue. There's no checking to see if the ballot that is sent back in is legitimate. No one has checked whether the voter is alive or dead. No one has checked whether the voter still lives at the street address he lived at 4 years ago. Those things are not being checked, so anybody could take the ballot, fill it out, sign the person's name, because guess what? They're not validating signatures either. Now, here's where mass mail balloting really gets into trouble. Let's say, because I live in a Democrat state, I get a unsolicited ballot from the government that says, fill this out, sign it, mail it in, and boom, you've just voted. And 4 million people have also just voted in that manner here in the United States already. So let's say further that because some of the states are mandating that ballots should be counted if they're received within 2 weeks following the election. Think of that. So the election's on November 3rd. Ballots coming in until the 17th would be counted. Again, no verification as to the legitimacy of the ballot. So let's say I get one of these ballots from the Commonwealth of Virginia, because I live in a blue state, and I fill it out, and I wait to mail it until November 2nd. So I go to the post office, I put the ballot in the box, the post office is going to postmark that November 2nd, and it goes in. Meanwhile, on the morning of November 3rd, before that ballot has arrived, I go to my precinct, show them my ID, and I vote. So now, Drew Nickel has voted twice. He's voted at the precinct like he normally does, and he's also mailed in a ballot. No one is going to check whether that mailed-in ballot was offset by my showing up at the poll or vice versa. So essentially, I potentially have 2 votes. Now, I'm not going to do that because doing that is against the law. It's a felony. If I misrepresent my ability to vote, or if I attempt to vote twice or more, I can be arrested and prosecuted with a felony, with a term in the U.S. prison of not less than 1 year. Or not U.S. prison, but the state prison. It's a violation of federal law to misrepresent your ability to vote in an election. But with all these mail-in ballots going out there, who's to say that Larry the liberal isn't going to fill out 10 of these ballots that he pulled out of his neighbors' mailboxes, sign their names to them, and send them in? Because nobody's going to check to see if that ballot was submitted bogusly or not. It's not like they have a machine that's going to check the signature. And that's the problem with mass mail ballots. And that's why I'm afraid about the legitimacy of this election, because there's so many states that are doing this. And I'm not talking about absentee ballots. Absentee ballots are different. And I had to vote absentee ballot once because business interests ensured that I was going to be out of town on election day. So what I did, I contacted my precinct and I told them, I'm going to be out on business the day of the election. I want to vote, but I won't be here to vote where I lived in Virginia at the time, which was Henrico County. So they verified that I am indeed a registered voter, and they sent me a ballot that required an affidavit. In other words, I would have to fill out the ballot, sign it in the presence of, say, a notary public or somebody like that, a notary public, and they would verify with my ID and my signature that I am the person I am, Drew Nickel, and I am voting in this election. And then I mail that in. It's been witnessed as an affidavit. An affidavit is a signed, sworn statement. I swear under penalty of law that I am casting this ballot, and this is the only ballot I'm going to cast, and that I'm legally registered to vote. That's not being checked on mass mail ballots. It doesn't work like that. It works like that for absentee ballots. The president is going to vote absentee because his precinct is in where he lives in Mar-a-Lago, Florida. That's located in the precinct where he votes. But he'll be voting absentee because he's in the White House. Legitimate absentee ballot. But what about these mass mail ballots? How do I know that a ballot isn't being sent to my own father's address in his name, and he's been dead since 2007? So somebody could take his ballot and cast it in his name, and the election board wouldn't know any different. And I know they wouldn't know any different because when I went to vote in 2016, because I'm named after my father, I had to stress which one of those was he and which one of those was me. He was already dead. So nobody's going to check to see if this ballot coming in from Drew's father, despite the fact that Drew's father would be now 107 years old, nobody's going to check to see whether he's died or not, or whether he lives on the street he used to live or not. They're not going to check that. And somebody could steal his ballot, vote in his name, and boom, you got an illegitimate vote. Now take that across the country. Recently in New York, there was a Democrat primary for Congresswoman Maloney's seat. And just in that local congressional nomination in New York City, 88,000 votes that came in were either lost or not counted or declared illegitimate. So many ballots that they really don't know to this day who won that primary. Of course, the powers to be are saying, oh no, she won it. She's the incumbent. She won it. But nobody really knows. Now, is that how we're supposed to elect our representatives? And if that's not how we're supposed to elect our representatives, then who in the Sand Hill says that we should elect our president the same way? We have always gone to the polls to elect our presidents in times of war, in times of epidemics, anything that would come along, we would still have our elections as scheduled. But no, the Democrats want to change that too, because they operate under the mantra that when you can't win, you change the rules. And that's what they want to do. They want to change the rules so that their guy can't lose. You see, when Donald Trump upset the apple cart of the globalist and the entrenched DC deep state, he did a couple of things. First, he knocked off of the platform, figuratively, of course, all of his Republican challengers. There were 16 other candidates vying for the nomination in 2016. And one by one, he shoved them all off because he had a populist message. He wanted to change this established deep state globalism that had taken over Washington. He also defeated Hillary Clinton. And never has there been a candidate who was more certain to win an election than Hillary Clinton. He won it because he outworked her. He would be having 5 events a day in front of 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, and more in stadiums across the country and in auditoriums and coliseums across the country. He outworked her because while she was taking a weekend off here or taking a day off there or putting a lid on today's activities like Joe Biden is famous for doing, Trump was out there flying from place to place to place, working for first the nomination, then working for the election. And even on election night, 2 o'clock in the morning following election night, he was still campaigning, and he was in Michigan after the polls closed, after election day. But he knew that there were still people who hadn't voted across the country, and he was trying to say, vote for me, I'm going to give you the change you've been wanting. And it turned out he won. He won because he outworked Hillary. But what happened since? The deep state tried to undo his nomination candidacy, his presidential candidacy in the fall election, and they kept going after the man for 3 years into his administration by following up on a concocted Russian hoax that Hillary Clinton did with the knowledge of Barack Obama. That's come out this past week. It was under the auspices of the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton when they were briefed in front of Joe Biden and James Comey, Hillary's scheme to create a false Russian hoax so she could divert media attention away from her email server scandal, which was very real. and they started concocting these wild stories about Trump being one of Putin's puppets and that Russia was trying to fix it, that he would win the election. And then after Trump won the election, they continued with that. James Comey kept signing off on warrants to the FISA courts, warrants that he knew were based on fraudulent information that Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party paid for. And what happened? We were put through 3 years of a Mueller investigation costing upwards of $45 million, and the country was put on hold 3 years. They even did this to try to bring down Trump. And when that turned out that there was no basis to it, they immediately went after impeachment, and they based an impeachment on a single phone call. They will stop at nothing. And this is what the Democratic Party has become. They will stop at nothing to see to it that Trump is denied a second term. And this time, they're leaving no chances like they might have in 2016 here and there. They're going after Trump with all guns pointed. All of the media, including Fox News, has gone to Biden's support. Yeah, there's a couple of commentators on Fox News like Sean Hannity or Laura Ingraham or Tucker Carlson, but the vast majority of the rest of Fox News, and I'll throw in even Maria Bartiromo from Fox Business News, those four people seem to be supportive of the president, but the rest of them, no. They want Trump to be defeated. And the reason why they want Trump to be defeated, because they know that if Trump is going to be reelected, there will be nothing to keep him from destroying the rest of that deep state that is so corrupt. Because he's going to go after these people. He's going to make the Hillary Clintons and the James Comeys of the world accountable for their actions. And yeah, we need to throw in Obama too, because he was in on it too. That's right. The last president of the United States took the unmitigated step of trying to destroy his successor's term. Barack Obama doesn't love this country. Hillary Clinton doesn't love this country. And neither do their co-conspirators in this attempted coup d'etat. They want to destroy the country, and they don't care who suffers as a result of it. That's what's behind all these riots. You know, all these riots are taking place in cities that have been run by Democrat mayors for decades, in primarily blue states. And the reason why the riots are happening there is because they know the governors, being Democrats, are not going to take advantage of Trump's offer to bring in the National Guards and put these riots to a stop. They would rather see their cities destroyed. They would rather see policemen killed by rioters. And don't tell me they're peaceful protesters. That's another lie that's been concocted by the media. These are rioting anarchists. Black Lives Matter, Antifa, they all advocate the destruction of the United States, and they all want it to be replaced with a communist government. If you go to Black Lives Matter website, it'll tell you that. They are a Marxist organization. Go to Antifa's website, and what they will tell you is they want to destroy the United States. So what is happening is these organizations are being funded by George Soros, who turns around and pays these people to wreak havoc in cities where they know all it takes is a match and the fire goes up. And Democrats are not even beyond that. They are more than happy to abide the destruction of their own city and the death of their own citizens, as long as that will serve to deny Trump a second term. So when you consider all of that, what do we have here? We've got a Democratic Party that has gone full evil on this country. They want to destroy the country. Every one of them. Pelosi, Schumer, Biden, Kamala Harris, they all want to destroy the country. And if people die in the streets, and if stores are looted, and cities are burned, they don't care as long as their overarching goal of defeating Trump is realized. That's what we've come to in the United States. That's what has become of our blessed country. They want to destroy the country because that will give them the impetus of forcing their vision on what proper government should be on an electorate that otherwise would never support these aims. That's why they're not answering questions in these debates. If Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed, are you going to try to pack the Supreme Court? They won't answer, because that's exactly what they intend to do if they win the election. They won't answer. Where is your list of the Supreme Court judges you would nominate, Mr. Biden? Trump gave us that list 4 years ago, and he stuck true to it. And Amy Coney Barrett was on that list. So we know that Trump stands by his word, and he tells us on the front end who he's going to nominate. And Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and now Barrett came from that list. For the first time, a presidential candidate said, here's who I will put on the courts if I'm elected. But Biden won't share that either, because he's just smart enough to know that if he were to distribute such a list, it would give people even more reason to vote against them. So he's not saying, just like he's not saying whether he'd pack the court. You see, here we have the difference between an honest candidate, Donald Trump, and a dishonest candidate, and that's Joe Biden. And this is why this is no longer a battle between conservative and liberal, or Democrat and Republican, or whatever past paradigms have been. This has become an election between the forces of good, who want to eradicate the corruption in Washington, who want to make sure that all things put American interests first, as they should. The difference is between that kind of a candidate and a candidate that ultimately wants to destroy free market capitalism, want to destroy individual rights, and want to destroy the underpinnings of our Constitution that protect our freedoms. And that's what it's come down to, a battle of good versus evil. And the more I hear the media criticize Trump, the more I am self-assured that what he is doing is right, because otherwise they wouldn't be so crazy in their making him out to be the evil person that he isn't. And that's what this election has come down to. It's not a question of whether or not a Republican or a Democrat is elected. It's whether or not this country and its marvelous history is going to be continued or rendered asunder by people who want to destroy this country. And if there's anything you should be thinking about as this election nears, it is this country smart enough to keep that from happening? Or are we so stupid that we would put a senile old man like Joe Biden in the White House, ultimately overruled by a very radical vice president in one Kamala Harris? So remember this when you're going to the polls this November, if you haven't already voted. And I hope and pray those of you who have voted have done so with wisdom, rather than reacting to the lies the media is feeding to us. This is Drew Nickell. We're approaching the end of the Nora Firestone Show. I'm going to be on for the next couple of hours with J.P. Morgan. I was on with him yesterday and the day before. He's asked me to come back today, so I'm looking forward to being on that show. But this is the end of this broadcast on the Nora Firestone Show. So I want to thank you for your attention. Remember to look me up at drewnickel.com, DREWNICKELL.com. And thank you so much for your audience and for listening in on today's show. On behalf of WKQA Freedom 1110 on your AM dial, I want to wish you all of the best on this glorious October day. Please get outside and enjoy some of this after you've listened to the next broadcast, because I'm going to actually be a guest on that show. So, thank you for tuning in. I appreciate your sharing your time with me, and I wish you all the best.